You work like a dog and we still can't afford a real life. I didn't sign up for this, Nate. I signed up for a man who could actually provide.
Don't.
We need to do this now.
Tessa, what is this?
Me being honest. Finally.
She handed me the divorce papers while my boss stood behind her, smiling like he'd already won. That's the moment I need you to understand first. Not because it was the worst moment of my life, but because it wasn't. Not even close. 3 weeks before she walked into that break room, a lawyer I almost threw in the trash had told me something that changed every single rule of the game. I just hadn't played my hand yet. I was standing next to the vending machine when the door opened. That's the detail that stuck. Not the flickering overhead lights. Not the burned coffee smell baked into the walls. Not the way my coworkers went unnaturally still the second she walked in. Like animals sensing weather. It was the machine. I'd fed it $4. Got nothing back. I'd just finished a 9-hour shift on the warehouse floor. Steel-toed boots soaked through. Shirt damp and heavy. My lower back had been quietly threatening to quit for the past 2 hours, and I still had inventory reports to finish before midnight. I wasn't trying to eat a good meal. I was trying to buy the cheapest sandwich in the building so I could survive 3 more hours. Then the door opened. Tessa walked in wearing heels I'd never seen before, holding a manila envelope, a designer bag on her shoulder I definitely hadn't paid for. Her face was different, calm in a way I'd never seen. Not peaceful. Final. She didn't come alone. Behind her, leaning against the door frame like he owned the building because technically he did, was my boss, Drew Callahan. 3 years of passive smiles and small humiliations. 3 years of being called buddy in a tone that meant nothing. 3 years of watching him take credit for every number I made happen while I told myself patience was a strategy. He was standing behind my wife. My brain tried to build an explanation. Found nothing. "We need to do this now," Tessa said. Flat, clean, the way you'd ask someone to move their car. She slid the envelope across the break room table. I looked down. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I didn't touch it. "Tessa." My voice came out quieter than I expected. "What is this?" She folded her arms. Me being honest. Finally. That hit harder than it should have. Drew said nothing. He just stood there, expensive watch, pressed shirt, that same expression he wore in every meeting where he knew something you didn't. "I can't keep doing this," she said. "You work constantly and we're still behind on everything. You come home exhausted, smelling like cardboard, talking about overtime like it's some kind of win." She exhaled. "This isn't a life, Nate." The way she said my name sounded like the end of something. "I've been trying," I said. "I know." She glanced back at him. "That's exactly the problem. This is your best." And just like that, every late night she didn't explain, every weekend she wasn't home, every time I'd noticed the distance and told myself I was imagining things, it all clicked into one ugly picture. "You're leaving me for him." She didn't flinch. "I'm leaving because I deserve better. I should have broken something. I should have dragged him out by his collar. I should have done something loud and irreversible. Instead, I stood there and watched her slide her wedding ring off her finger and place it on the table like it was a receipt she was returning. And in the silence, something settled in me. Quiet and cold and perfectly clear. I wasn't losing a wife. I was finally seeing who she'd always been. The 3 days that followed were the kind of gray that doesn't have a name. I went to work. I answered emails. I signed off on inventory logs with the same pen I'd used for years. I slept on my side of a bed that felt too wide and too honest. Her closet was half empty. The bathroom shelves stripped clean, except for a cheap hair tie she'd forgotten, and a cracked bottle of lotion she used to complain I could never afford to replace. By the 4th day, the silence started talking back. That's when I opened the letter. It had been sitting under a stack of overdue bills for almost 3 weeks. Thick cream envelope. My full legal name printed across the front in a font that looked expensive. Nathan James Cole III. A name I almost never used. A name that belonged to court documents and death certificates, not to a man buying $4 sandwiches from a machine that kept stealing his money. I'd almost thrown it away twice. The firm's name meant nothing. The return address did, downtown high-rise district. the kind of address where decisions get made about people who will never see the room they're made in. I almost didn't go. Honestly, the only reason I did was because I figured it was connected to old debt. My mother's medical bills had left shadows in places I still hadn't fully mapped. Bad news was the only kind of surprise my life had ever served me without warning. But I went. The office had walnut walls and leather chairs and that particular stillness that money buys. A silver-haired attorney stood when I walked in, actually stood, like my presence meant something. "Mr. Cole," he said, "thank you for coming. I'm Gerald Ashworth." I sat carefully, still in my work boots, still faintly smelling of dust and diesel. "Your uncle passed away approximately 3 weeks ago," he said. I frowned. My uncle. I barely had one. Then a memory surfaced, dim, 20 years old. A man in a dark suit at my mother's funeral. A firm handshake. A business card. An envelope with $5,000 in it and a note that said "use this well." Then nothing for 2 decades. "I barely knew him," I said. Gerald nodded like that was exactly what he expected. "He knew enough about you." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were account summaries, trust documents, equity schedules, pages of numbers so large they stopped looking real. My eyes kept sliding off the figures like they couldn't find grip. "Your uncle spent 40 years building a private investment portfolio, early technology acquisitions, industrial holdings, board-level equity positions." Gerald's voice stayed even. At the time of his death, the estate was valued at approximately $470 million. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because it was impossible. There has to be a mistake. There isn't. You are his sole heir. For days ago, my wife had left me in a break room because I wasn't enough. Because I was small, ordinary, stuck. And now a stranger in a tailored suit was telling me I had just inherited more money than I could spend in 4 lifetimes. But it was the next sentence that stopped the room. "Among the inherited assets," Gerald said, tapping a document near the bottom of the stack, "is a controlling equity stake in Meridian Group Holdings." I looked down at the name. I knew it. Every employee at my company knew it. Meridian Group Holdings was the parent company. The one at the top of the org chart that nobody in the warehouse ever thought about. The one that owned the building I worked in. The one that owned Drew Callahan's entire career. The one that now belonged to me. Tessa had left a broke warehouse worker. She had no idea she'd just walked away from the man who owned everything her new husband had ever stood on. I sat very still in that leather chair. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel anything like grief. I didn't move fast. That's what people never understand about this part. If I'd wanted fast, Gerald could have had Drew Callahan escorted from the building before Tessa finished unpacking her things into his spare closet. 1 board meeting. 1 vote. Done. But I'd learned something from 3 years of being the person nobody looked at. Patience is only invisible to people who don't believe you're capable of it. I resigned 2 weeks later. No confrontation. No speech. I handed a short letter to the front desk, cleared my locker, shook hands with the few people who'd ever treated me like a person, and walked out of Callahan Logistics on a Tuesday afternoon like I was just another burned-out middle manager who'd finally had enough. Drew didn't even look up when I put the envelope on his desk. "Probably for the best," he said, leaning back. "Some people just aren't built to handle pressure." I almost smiled. The divorce finalized quietly. Tessa married him 19 days later. The photos were exactly what you'd expect. Rented elegance, gold accents, flowers that looked like they'd been chosen to impress strangers. She smiled like she had finally arrived somewhere that mattered. He stood beside her with one hand at her waist and the expression of a man who had never once considered the possibility of losing. People sent me the pictures. Framed it as concern. Just thought you should know. I did know. I was already 3 steps ahead of everything they thought they'd won. Behind the scenes, Gerald built the machine quietly. Forensic accountants, labor attorneys, HR compliance investigators, people with serious credentials and no appetite for drama. They began a full audit of every division under Meridian Group Holdings, but I told Gerald where to start. Callahan Logistics first. What we found was worse than I expected. Drew hadn't just taken my wife. He'd been stealing from the company for years. Vendor kickbacks funneled through shell contracts. Inflated invoices tied to a transport company owned by a cousin nobody had bothered to flag. Safety budgets cut quietly while executive bonuses increased loudly. Injury reports buried. Overtime records manipulated. 2 harassment complaints settled under seal and then erased from institutional memory. 1 floor supervisor forced out after refusing to falsify compliance documents. And the workers paid for every single bit of it. Men with compressed discs and busted wrists who kept showing up because rent was due. Women who stayed quiet because speaking up had consequences they'd already watched happen to someone else. People who had done exactly what I'd done, worked hard, stayed patient, believed that if they just kept going, loyalty would eventually matter. I met some of them in person. Coffee shops, parking lots, a church office where a woman felt safe enough to finally say the things she'd been holding for 2 years. They told me things they'd never dared put in writing. The retaliation, the threats, the way Drew cultivated fear because fear made people efficient and efficient people didn't ask questions. By the time Tessa posted a beach photo from their honeymoon with the caption, "Finally living the life I deserve," I was reading sworn statements that would dismantle everything she thought she'd married into. The strange thing was, the more evidence I gathered, the less it felt personal. This had stopped being about a marriage. This was about what men like Drew Callahan did when no one with real power ever looked their direction. And now someone was looking. The morning I went back, it was raining hard, not soft rain, the kind that makes glass towers look colder than they already are. I stood across the street from Meridian Group headquarters in a charcoal suit that still felt unfamiliar across my shoulders and watched people rush through the front doors with umbrellas and coffee and the casual confidence of people who have never once had to question whether they belonged somewhere. 90 days earlier, I'd walked through a loading bay entrance in steel-toed boots. That morning, I went through the front. The board meeting was listed simply as ownership transition and strategic review. Gerald had worded it carefully. Nothing in the language raised flags. Drew had no reason to prepare for anything other than a routine quarterly review. When I stepped into the boardroom, most of the seats were filled. 12 board members around a polished table. Executives along the wall. Assistants near the back. Water glasses nobody had touched. And there he was, Drew Callahan, relaxed in his chair, scrolling his phone, expensive jacket draped just right. He glanced up when I entered, the automatic, dismissive glance he gave everyone who walked through a door, and then his entire face changed. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that looked very much like fear. Gerald closed the door behind me and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I'd like to formally introduce Nathan James Cole III, sole heir to the estate of Raymond Cole, and majority controlling shareholder of Meridian Group Holdings. Effective today, your new chairman." The silence that followed was not polite. Drew pushed back from his chair. That's not possible. He worked for me." "I did," I said, walking to the head of the table. "Please sit down." He didn't want to, but he did. I opened the folder in front of me and looked around the room. Over the past 90 days, I authorized a full internal audit of every division under Meridian Group Holdings. What we found raises serious legal, financial, and ethical concerns, and Callahan Logistics is, by a significant margin, the most compromised entity in this portfolio. I clicked the remote. The first slide hit the screen. Vendor fraud, OSHA violations, suppressed injury reports, harassment settlements, budget manipulation, executive bonus inflation, documented retaliation against workers who reported misconduct. By the third slide, no one in the room was pretending this was routine. By the sixth, Drew had gone the color of old paper. "These numbers are being misrepresented," he said sharply. "You don't understand operations at this level." "I understand enough," I said, "to know that you approved a personal bonus increase 11 days after denying replacement safety harnesses for the warehouse floor team." The room went completely still. I kept going. Sworn testimony, bank records, contract trails, HR suppression memos, names, dates, signatures, dollar amounts. No raised voice, no theatrics, Just evidence, page by page, building into something that couldn't be walked back. When I finished, I closed the folder. Drew, your employment is terminated effective immediately. For cause. You are barred from all company property, denied severance, and referred for civil and criminal review pending legal counsel's recommendation. He stood up so fast his chair hit the wall. This is revenge. I looked at him directly. No, I said. This is what accountability looks like when the right person finally signs the paperwork. Security was already at the door. 3 years. Took less than 20 minutes. Tessa found out before noon. Not because I called her. Because men like Drew always call home the moment the story changes. She called me 3 times. I let it ring. On the 4th call, I answered. No greeting. Just breathing. Unsteady. Disbelieving. What did you do? She demanded. I looked out the window of the office that used to belong to my uncle. The city below was still wet from the morning rain. I did my job. Don't do that. Don't act like this is normal. Drew said you humiliated him in front of the entire board. Drew humiliated himself, I said. I just made sure the right people finally saw it. Her voice hardened. This is about me. No, I said quietly. This is about buried injury reports, manipulated contracts, silenced workers, and a man who ran a company like his personal account. You leaving me just happened to show me clearly what kind of man you chose. A long silence. Then softer, almost careful. You could have warned us. I let that sit for a moment. She still said us. Even now, even standing in the wreckage of everything, she still spoke like they were a unit I owed consideration to. I owed the workers protection, I said. I owed the process its integrity. I didn't owe either of you mercy. The weeks that followed moved fast. Without Drew's salary, the mortgage on their house became unsustainable almost immediately. The luxury SUV disappeared. Then the housekeeper. Then the invitations to events where they'd recently smiled for photos with people who no longer answered the phone. His industry contacts went quiet. Civil claims surfaced. Former employees came forward once they understood he had no power left to hurt them with. The man who used to walk the warehouse floor like he was doing everyone a favor started appearing in search results with words like misconduct, negligence, fraud attached to his name. Tessa called again about a month later. This time she was crying. Not dramatically, just the exhausted, worn-down kind of crying that happens when reality finally stops offering exits. I made a mistake, she whispered. I let the silence sit between us. Some truths deserve room. You didn't make a mistake, I said finally. You made a choice. She didn't respond. I heard her breathing change. Then nothing. I heard through people we both knew that the marriage was unraveling under the weight of debt, blame, and the specific resentment that grows between two people when the dream they chased together stops delivering. Drew spent his days angry at everyone except himself. Convinced everything had been taken from him. It hadn't. It had simply stopped being protected from consequences. And that, more than the firing, more than the headlines, more than any public moment, was where justice finally landed. Not in a boardroom, not in a phone call, but in the quiet, private reckoning that comes when two people have to sit alone inside the truth of what they chose and realize there's no one left to redirect the blame. I still think about Tessa sometimes. Not with anger. Not anymore. I think about that cheap hair tie she left on the bathroom shelf. The one small thing she forgot. The one thing that wasn't part of the plan she'd been building while I was putting in overtime. She handed me divorce papers like I was nothing. What she didn't know was that the man she called too ordinary, too small, too stuck. That man had already signed documents that owned her entire future. She left before she ever found out who she was actually married to. And by the time she did, it was already too late to matter.